Reform's recent policy announcement shows, in my view, both why the Conservatives need reform and why reform needs the Conservatives. First of all, the policy announcement is excellent, it is common sense, it's really quite extraordinary the extent to which we have been funding people who have no absolute right to be here. It seems to me quite clear that the national health and welfare system should be available for two groups of people. One group are British citizens, those who have an absolute right to be here, who have a British passport, and have been part of the system for some time. The other group, of course, are those that we have specifically invited in. So that would include the Ukrainians and the people from Hong Kong who are British nationals overseas, who are effectively British, but by a quirk of law were rendered effectively stateless when we handed Hong Kong over to communist China. Those people, all these people, are one of us, that they have a right or they have an invitation to be involved in our system, in our civic society, and we want them to be included in it. People who have come here voluntarily, who wish to be British, who may be economic migrants or asylum seekers, obviously have a different set of entitlements. They should only be able to get what they pay for. They should be funded perhaps by charities who wish to contribute to their support, or by their own efforts, or by their own communities who are already here. The idea that you can come here and then claim benefits is actually monstrous, an outrage on the British taxpayer. And hearing today a BBC report that says that illegal migrants housed in hotels, free accommodation, support for the children they have when they get here, and taxis costing hundreds of pounds taking them to appointments, offends most right-thinking British people. People who have come here illegally seem to be being better treated than people who are in fact British passport holders. So that side of the policy is really good, really impressive, is exactly what we need to be saying, and it's easier for Reform to say because they weren't in charge for 14 years, and people can't just say to them, well, why didn't you do that before? And there's another very good bit of it. I cannot tell you how pleased I was when Zia Youssef, when asked, well, how would you do this legally, said Parliament will pass an act. The fact that you've got a senior politician who understands what Bill Cash has been saying for the whole of his political career, that the power is there if only you wish to use it, that the power is there in a sovereign parliament, that our basic constitutional principle of parliamentary sovereignty, as set out by Dicey at the beginning of the 20th century, could not be clearer. There is nothing Parliament can do that is not by its nature of being done by Parliament law. And this is really important and needs to be understood, that Parliament may pass any act, may override any international agreement, may pass laws that override what the courts have said. The courts are independent to judge what Parliament has said, not independent to overrule Parliament. It's a fundamental point of our Constitution, and we have a dualist system. Foreign law, foreign agreements, international treaties are only part of UK law insofar as Parliament makes them part of UK law. So the European Communities Act and the treaties that flowed from it were only our law because of the European Communities Act 1972. The Refugee Convention comes into our law because Parliament has brought it into our law. The European Convention on Human Rights comes into our law because Parliament brought it into our law, particularly in the Human Rights Act 1998. And what Parliament brings in, it can cut out again. So what Zia Youssef is saying is really important, fundamental constitutional point that explains how you do difficult things. And there may be arguments about retrospective legislation. And they're important arguments. And I can tell you that when a bill comes to Parliament, it has been considered by a Cabinet Committee that will look at whether or not it has any retrospective effect. And the Attorney General at that stage has a right of veto to say this bill is retrospective and that is improper. So there is built into our system a protection against retrospection, but it is one that Parliament can and has on occasions overruled. Parliament has said, we accept that retrospection is in principle wrong, but on this occasion it is fair. And it seems to me that there is a reasonable argument to say that if you are not a British citizen, even if you have been getting benefits, you will not continue to get them. You can't have a presumption that the benefits will continue for the whole of your life. And I think it's also reasonable to say that if you have not already applied for British citizenship, new rules may apply to your application in future. I don't think that is what is meant by retrospection. Retrospection really is there to stop something that you did yesterday becoming a crime tomorrow. It's not there to stop the eligibility for benefits in future being changed, or indeed to stop the right to British citizenship being changed in some way. So Zea's got it right, Parliament can legislate, Reform has got it right, we should not be paying large amounts of money to foreign people who happen to be living in this country. That's the first bit. But there is a second bit. You knew the but was coming. The second bit is that this policy, in headline excellent, in detail, came under stinging and effective attack. And what was that attack? Well, first of all, the Centre for Policy Studies said that the figure that Reform was using wasn't right. So the £234 billion of saving is not a figure that the author of the figure any longer stands by. And this matters because instead of the news that the policy gathered being about the general thrust of it, it was in a mistake on detail, on saying that this isn't the right amount of money. And frankly, the 234 billion is not the point. The point is there will be very significant savings. There are important amounts of money to save in future from taking away benefits from people who aren't British. Another problem was highlighted, that in the numbers, the people who'd come from Hong Kong hadn't been taken into account. And there are a couple of 100,000 of them who have come over at our invitation to protect them from a totalitarian communist regime, a regime that keeps Jimmy Lai in prison, and to whom we had the strongest moral obligation. Bear in mind that Hong Kong is the only former colony that instead of offering independence to, we handed over to a totalitarian regime. It was handed over to Red China in 1997, even though we could have kept Hong Kong Island. And all the people in it lost the right to live automatically in the UK under the 1981 British Nationality Act. They were left really only with a choice of being Chinese, even though some of them never wished to be, would never have voted to be Chinese, and are finding the Chinese administration in Hong Kong is increasingly oppressive, anti-free speech, totalitarian in the same way as China itself is. So these people were handed over. The only colony, you know what you're about to say, but you're going to say Chagos. Chagos hasn't yet been handed over. Chagos will only be the second colony handed over to somebody else rather than granted self-determination. It's why the treatment of Chagos is so bad. But those Hong Kong people, Hong Kong, British national overseas, BNO passport holders haven't been included. And then there's the issue around European settlers with settled status. What is going to be done with them? And there seemed to be an element of a lack of clarity. Personally, I think that we will have to stick to the agreement that we made, but that one of the great things of Brexit is that we're no longer taking on those liabilities. No more do we have to have people from the European Union to whom we pay endless benefits, and we should certainly stop paying benefits to any European national of Europe, an EU member state, to be more strictly accurate, who is not actually physically living in the United Kingdom. So there are great things in the policy, but there are difficulties within the details. What the Conservative Party does, has done for a very long time, is consider policy in detail. This makes our policy presentation slow. It makes it laborious. In my view, too slow. It should have been faster. We need to get on with things. But it means that when the policy is announced, it is robust. So Reform is doing a brilliant job at coming up with ideas. It is coming forth with things that certainly as a Conservative, I strongly support the principle of. And the principle of parliamentary sovereignty is something I've talked about almost as much as Bill Cash, though over a shorter political career. That's all terrific, but the devil is in the detail. And to win the country over, to persuade people that you are ready for government, the details need to be right. And this isn't the first policy that reform has produced where the detail begins to fray at the edges. Unravel might be a little bit unkind. And so Conservative expertise combined with the vigour of reform is, to my mind, the best way to proceed, to ensure that we unite the right, we come together, we can make sure our policies are robust, but we don't lose the enthusiasm that a new party has. We don't get bound up in the, well, we tried that before and it didn't work approach that so besets long-standing parties and parties particularly that have been in government for a long time. So the message is clear. Reunite the right, but listen very carefully to what's coming out of reform. It is certainly small c conservative.